Is British politics changing? Now, I want to be very frank. British politics has always been adversarial. We've always had multiple sides. But in recent times, it seems like things are getting more and more contentious, whether it's Brexit in 2017 or it's immigration issues or even the cultural wars we see online. It seems as though we are more divided. How is this affecting communities? Today, I'm joined by Dr. Bankole, who is a lecturer in politics. I'm going to talk a bit about some of these issues. Now, the first question I have for you, Bankole, is essentially, that thing I said at the top. Are we in a unique period in British politics, or am I making much ado about nothing? Is it the case that we've just always been divided?
We have always been divided, right? And we've always had left and right. We've always had this kind of adversarial politics. If you look at how the House of Commons is laid out, for example, for people who've been there before, you have these two benches facing each other, essentially screaming at each other in these big debates we see, especially parliamentary questions, right? So that's always been a feature of our politics, this adversarial, combative nature. But I think what's happened in recent years is debates have become more coarsened. We actually saw during Brexit, which you referenced earlier, an MP lose her life. She was murdered by someone who viewed her as an enemy of Britain, someone who viewed her position on the debate as posing a threat to what he viewed as the future of Britain, right? So we are seeing debates coarsen. We've also seen an MP, I think David Ames, he was killed by an Islamist, right? So we are seeing MPs lose their lives because of violence. We're seeing MPs threatened. We're seeing MPs abused on social media on a consistent basis. So something has changed. Our debates have become coarsened. I think social media plays a role, but also the nature of the debates and also maybe mainstream parties not pushing back against some problematic rhetoric on issues like immigration has meant that some extreme ideas have become mainstreamed in our politics, and we begin to see members of society as enemies. So as a member of the British public, maybe you have a view where there are some people you rub shoulders with on a day-to-day basis who are everything that's wrong with Britain, right? That feels far more kind of exaggerated now than it was in the past, where, of course, there's always been racism, there's always been sexism, there's always been an enemy of some description, but it feels like more so now people are willing to take up or really act in violent ways against those who they view as a problem. So we saw, obviously, in the summer, people try essentially to burn asylum seekers alive, right? That says to me that there's something changing in Britain where people are treating those who they view as their enemies in quite violent ways.
And where do you think some of this is coming from? Because, of course, someone here might say, well, hold on, what's your reference point? Because in 2004, during the Iraq War, we saw the largest demonstrations we've seen. There was bitter debate. It nearly split this country, in half in terms of perspectives. And so, to your point, there's always been adversaries. There's always been back and forth. Is this a blip that we've seen in the past, or do you think British politics has fundamentally shifted and the track we're going down in is an ever-increasing kind of, this adversarial nature, essentially?
I think there's definitely been a shift in terms of where we were maybe from the start of the noughties, where debates just felt, debates were hostile and heated, but it feels like now the very physical integrity of some parliamentarians is under threat. Like, I know some MPs who are not holding constituency surgeries because they're like, look, I could be attacked. That's something that's new. That's something that has definitely shifted. I think social media, again, we view people less as human beings as more as punching bags. So people say what they want on social media and, it can be abusive, knowing that, they're not maybe going to face the repercussions they would if they were to say things in person. So that shifted the dial a bit as well. And we're also seeing political campaigns run on the basis of an enemy. So in America, obviously Donald Trump has just won the presidency in the US, and one of the fundamental tenets of his campaign was mass deportation. So immigrants are framed as a big problem at the southern border especially, and it's like, we need to get rid of some of these guys, right? And that's something that's a real driver in terms of votes for Donald Trump. Not the only driver, of course, but one of the big drivers. In the UK, we have Nigel Farage, whose whole political campaign and career has been based on immigrants being a problem, right? So his diagnosis is Britain is broken, and guess what's the cause of that? It's immigrants, right? And what's happened in our politics is mainstream parties haven't actually pushed back against rhetoric. They've in some ways tried to adopt that rhetoric as like, oh, no, Farage has a point. We wouldn't go as far as him, but we do agree immigration is a problem. So yesterday, Keir Starmer makes this big speech where he says, the Conservative Party has been too liberal on immigration. We need to kind of close the borders. And what he's doing is he's adopting the framing of Farage. It's like, no, these people are a problem, and we need to stop them from coming into Britain in such large numbers. Now, when you kind of mainstream these ideas, what you're doing is, rather than challenging these really problematic ideas. And you can have an adult debate about immigration where you acknowledge that some controls are needed, but we need a fair and kind of compassionate system. That's totally fine. But by adopting the Farage framing of immigration's a problem, these people kind of using the language of borders and controlling that way, what you're doing is you're mainstreaming these ideas, and Farage will just get more extreme. So if you propose, I don't know, in immigration caps, we're going to get numbers down to tens of thousands, but like Cameron proposed, Farage will just go a bit further, right? So you're providing the ground or the kind of the space for these far right parties by kind of consenting to their ideas to go even further and push our debate further to the right and become more hostile.
Yeah. I mean, one way you can see the change is, of course, in 2007, Nigel Farage, then with UKIP, was dismissed by David Cameron as a party of fruitcakes and loonies. Of course, now he's in Parliament, and as of yesterday, now has 6 MPs. So things have changed quite a bit, and that I guess maybe illustrates some of that change. A recent poll found that 63% of Britons feel like politics is more divisive than ever. The question I'm also wondering, though, is there's always been that sort of chicken or egg conversation, which is, an MP becomes an MP because he's voted for by the people. So is it people who find British politics more divisive more than ever right now? Is it because we are more divisive than ever, or is it that somehow, the parliament we have, the political discourse we have is somewhat separate from local communities?
It's a good question. I think what we see in society is mirrored in Parliament. So people don't disagree that well anymore. I often think people can be too quick to label others who they disagree with as you are an X, right? So you are a fascist, or you are a this or that or the other. And we've gotten just really bad at having discussions where we might disagree fundamentally, but we're able to like shake hands and be like, do you know what? I disagree with you on this topic, but I don't see you as a kind of a bad person because you hold this view. So in society, I think we need to get to a place where we disagree with one another better. I don't think social media's helped with that, in that we often exist in silos. So you have maybe one camp, I don't know, a right-wing camp, a left-wing camp. You see yourself attached quite strongly to that camp and view everyone else who's outside of that camp as an enemy or as someone who's to be opposed. And that means that you dehumanize the other side. And I think what's important to understand is that people often arrive to a position on the left or the right or the centre, and that might be based on their lived experience or the things they consume. And just because they arrive to that position that you might disagree with, it doesn't mean that they are less of a person than you or they should be shunned by you. And we see that in our politics, right? We see MPs on the right speak about MPs on the left in quite polemic terms, and vice versa. So we've got to this place now where there is no longer this idea of, maybe working across parties in the way we used to see, this idea of coming together when we need to. So much of it's so adversarial, and it's partly because, in some ways, if you're, for example, Farage, a lot of his language around the time Brexit was, I'm standing for the British people, not those guys. Those guys are working against Britain's interests. If you use the language of them and us consistently, and of course there isn't a them and us element of it, but if you're constantly kind of using this combative language where you're framing yourself as the true defender of the British people, you are by kind of implicitly maybe in some ways saying those people are against the British people. So that language, that framing, this kind of existing in silos has meant that debates again have just become so coarsened.
Yeah. And what's fascinating doubly as well is that, of course, people live in integrated communities. It's very hard, unless you go to some very rural part of the country, to live in this kind of homogeneous community where everyone agrees and believes the same thing. I just don't think it exists. And so that whole disagreeing without being disagreeable, realizing that you might live 1 meter away from somebody, but have views that are 1 mile away. These sort of things we used to hold up as, I guess, because we used to have a really lovely, polite kind of public culture of deference and allowing, letting live and live and let live, all this sort of stuff. And it does strike me as interesting that we've reached a place now where people see differences as something that has to be squashed and got rid of, and people aren't comfortable being around people who don't have the same perspectives, but being able to kind of, after disagreeing, go, hey, let's go out for a drink, because we're part of the same country at the end of the day. There is a sort of us versus them thing. I do wonder where it's coming from, though, because it doesn't seem to be a solely UK phenomenon. In fact, since 2010, again, another poll that came out last year found that populist parties have increased their voter share by 15% since 2010. So this immigration talk, this shut the borders talk, this they are the enemy talk, somehow seems to be working, in that more parties across Europe are winning and are winning big. Where do you think this kind of appetite is coming from for these populist parties?
So I think when you look across Europe, right, things are broken. So inequality is growing in so many European states. People are in the UK, we're looking about NHS waiting lists, for example. The housing crisis, it's not just a UK thing, it's happening across Europe, where rents are skyrocketing, people can't buy their homes, people are, living hand to mouth in some ways and not being able to pay their bills. Things are broken across Europe, right? There's inequality, all of these things. And one of the things that's been blamed for that is, obviously we know over the last 50, 60 years, European democracies have become far more diverse. So what some of these populist leaders are saying is, hey, the reason why your life is messed up is because those people have come here, taken your opportunities, taken your jobs, and this rhetoric is not being kind of thoroughly pushed back by mainstream parties. Actually, in many ways, mainstream parties absorb this rhetoric. So when you kind of say, well, actually, these guys have a point, or you panic because they might be taking some votes off you, rather than pushing back against the rhetoric, you again kind of make these debates on immigration kind of so divisive, where you are viewing we often don't view immigrants as people. We view them as these kind of objects of political discourse, these numbers, and we've completely dehumanized our discussions on these topics. So I think over time, mainstream parties haven't done a good enough job of challenging these kind of populist analysis, which starts from a place of societies are broken, which is a fine diagnosis, right? I think people can look around Britain today and be like, there's a cost of living crisis, we have kind of people in precarious work. In so many ways, Britain is broken.
But I do wonder, when was Britain not broken?
But it feels even more broken so the working man feels like his life is in decline. Britain's never been perfect. No nation's ever been perfect. But it feels like, based on where Britain should be as a nation, it feels like we're so far away from where we should or can be. It feels like things are, maybe the mid-noughties was like a golden age for many people in Britain, where things seem to work fairly okay. Child poverty came down in quite a profound way. Employment, maybe pre the financial crisis, was in a fairly good place. Things were working sufficiently right? It didn't feel like people were as polarized as they are now. And I think now what's happening over time is things are breaking over time. NHS is crumbling. There's so many sectors. My sector, the university sector, universities are beginning to crumble, right? So across Britain, things are getting much, much worse. Again, they've never been perfect.
Yeah.
And I think what's happening is, at the same time as things are getting broken, the demographic has changed in so many of these European democracies. And what's the kind of simple analysis is, that's the reason why. Is that person's come to this country that's changed things for you, it's made things worse. And mainstream parties haven't really provided kind of any analysis that pushes back against this.
I think what really saddens me as well, when I, as a political junkie say, is just how many sort of rungs we've moved down when I think about public discourse. Because to your point about, that framing is ubiquitous. It's everywhere when you think about it. Britain's broken Britain. There's been shows on Channel 4 and everywhere about this broken Britain thing. And I recently was thinking about this idea of, when wasn't Britain broken? So based on your analysis, it seems as though the 3 years perhaps pre the fourth quarter of 2007, when you had Brown saying we've abolished boom and bust, and economic growth we're having. That seems like the small period people are like, that was when things were good, and you go, well, that strikes me as an exception and not the norm, because you pick a point history-wise, and if we go there and start walking kind of towards now, I can't find any country where there's like a through line. I mean, on GDP, there tends to be a through line because naturally we're making more things, there's more people, whatever. But there is no through line that just goes up. So I just wonder if one of the issues that we're seeing with political parties and British culture in general is a refusal to engage on that sort of nuanced discussion of, well, we can't have it all. There's trade-offs, right? If we want to have an amazing NHS, it might mean we're not number one in the league tables when it comes to like GDP, or because we have to make some concessions. If we're going to have a great education system, it might mean we're not number two. But it seems as though political parties are telling people, you can have it all. And if you vote for me, I'm going to give it all to you. So is the emergence, maybe we're getting too technical here, but is the emergence of the kind of catch-all party type really one of the things that's plaguing us in that you want every single vote, and so you're going to tell every single person what they need to hear so they have your vote, and so you keep setting expectations that you can't meet. And now we're having these very thin discussions about us versus them, this enemy versus that enemy, and we're not talking about trade-offs.
Yeah, I think the point of trade-offs is interesting, right? So you can't have it all. You can't be the party that fixes every single problem. There are trade-offs, right? If you are addressing the NHS waiting list, it might mean you have to tax people a bit more, right? And that's something that people might not be happy about. But that's the nature of how these things kind of go. There are natural trade-offs when it comes to policy making. And again, I don't think political parties have come up with the right ideas or the right analysis in terms of the problems we face. Like I said, so many of the parties have fallen down the trap of immigration being a real problem we need to address and not providing this kind of thorough analysis of why Britain truly is broken. And we need to get to that position first. We need to understand what's going on in terms of why Britain is broken before we can then move forward in terms of trying to have better discussions on this. Because so much of the discussion does seem to be, to varying degrees, right? So Keir Starmer's not saying the same things Farage is saying about immigration, right? He's still framing it as a problem that needs to be controlled, and he's making it an important part of his platform, partly because reform came second in 89 Labour seats. So Labour looking over their shoulder thinking, oh gosh, we want to keep those guys who are voting for reform on our side by having some kind of platform that is tonally maybe anti-migration. It might be kind of in policy nowhere near what Farage is offering, but tonally you have to signal to these voters, hey, look, we're going to say some kind of tough truths on immigration. And the Conservative Party on the bad knock, one of her first gambits has been to give a speech about immigration being a problem, right? So she's kind of sat there looking all professional, saying immigration is a problem. I'm going to tell you the truth about immigration, right? So both parties have essentially said, which is what Farage is saying, not the language of Farage, but hey, immigration is a problem. So that's not thorough analysis of where we are in Britain, right? It's not just immigration that means we have skyrocketing in the NHS list. The NHS is a kind of a sector propped up by immigrants in terms of, my mother was an NHS worker, for example. I know plenty of other kind of immigrant mothers and fathers who work in the NHS and in the transport sector. So many of our public sectors have been kind of held up in many ways by people who've come over to the country in the last 60, 70 years. So we need more thorough analysis about the problems in Britain. And we need to move beyond this idea of kind of one of the starting points being this kind of immigration's a problem and these people of colour or etc. These kind of marginalised communities are a problem. But that's where it feels like so much of analysis starts, not just in Britain, but across Europe. It's like these people are a problem. It's poor analysis.
Yeah. And I guess, just landing this a bit, I just wonder what you think we can do to not pursue unity for unity's sake, but, if local communities, if we're gonna really build kind of a community's resilience to these sort of different issues we're speaking about, I think we need just a better politics. We need, again, maybe I'm declaring my libertarian hand here, but we need a politics that's about ideas, where you're going to see interesting, conversations about, how we need to fundamentally change this or change that. And it seems as though we're still not quite there yet. We're still talking about, who's to blame, say, or, what do academics, what do political parties, what do institutions need to do better so that we get to a place where the political discourse or the public discourse is far more rich, nuanced, and built around ensuring community success and not just sort of pointing the finger.
There are so many things. I think we need to have better informed debates is the first thing. So one of the key problems in our politics is we don't even agree on the facts anymore. So often you'd have a shared set of facts that we might disagree in terms of how we interpret those facts. Now we're not even agreeing or playing by the same rules. So a good example is the US, right? In the US, they were not playing by the same rules, the Republicans, as the Democrats. The Democrats ran a very centrist, kind of like policy-focused campaign. Republicans ran a very polemic campaign that focused on anger and mobilizing anger and emotion, right? And saying things that were just fundamentally not true. They were lying a lot of the time. Now, politicians are dishonest to varying degrees, but what we saw from the Republicans was something on a whole nother scale. And we see similar things in the UK where people are using stats and using evidence in ways that are totally, totally poor. So we need better informed debates is the first thing. We need to disagree better as well. So once we do have a shared set of facts, it's about, okay, look, you might interpret us differently, but doesn't mean you're evil, doesn't mean you're this, that, and the other. Let's have a discussion, let's have a debate, let's have an informed debate on these different things, and let's try and reach a consensus. Or maybe we don't reach a consensus, but at least we're having these debates and we shake hands and we move on, right? So that needs to happen. There's kind of adversarial politics within some kind of like some boundaries. There needs to be some boundaries. It shouldn't be that MPs in Britain are not holding constituency surgeries because they feel they're going to be attacked, right? So we need to have better informed debates. We need to have debates where we share the same set of facts and we just interpret them differently potentially. Experts like myself, scholars are being kind of sidelined. We're seen as like these kind of a threat to Britain, or we're acting against British interests. Michael Gove a few years ago gave a big rant about experts and scholars, and we're seen as kind of some kind of like liberal elite class. So maybe don't shun people who are doing some rigorous work on these topics. This is not me blowing my own trumpet, but we need, again, to my point about informed debates, we do need some level of kind of rigorous analysis as part of our debates, as part of our discussions. And I guess one of the big things is we need to stop dehumanizing one another. So much of the immigration debates, go back to that topic, involves dehumanizing people. We use these labels, immigrant, refugee, asylum seeker. Again, these labels are labels, but at the end of the day, when we kind of pull back from these labels, that's a human being. And it makes it difficult, so to kind of chicken and egg here, it makes it difficult for someone to integrate in this country, which is something that people see as a problem, if you're constantly using dehumanizing language about these people. So one of the things we need to kind of scale back is the tone of the debates. Social media plays a role in that. I think on Twitter, abuse is so commonplace on Twitter now that it's almost laughable. It's a joke. So scaling back on the tone of our debates as well, and having more kind of empathetic, less dehumanizing language, all of those things will help. Because if you're standing shoulder to shoulder with someone who you view as an enemy of the state, or all of your problems in Britain are because of that person, that's of course going to lead to quite rough and coarsened discussions where you aren't having kind of debates with people in the right tone. So all of that contributes, I think, to kind of poor debates in terms of the facts, the tone of the debates. All of these things are things we need to change. It's not going to happen overnight because we've reached a place where things are quite bleak. And that's me being kind of honest here. We've seen two MPs killed by members of the public. Things aren't in a good place. We see MPs abused by constituents and also by members, other MPs, right? So things are in a really dark place, but we can slowly, incrementally work towards a place where things are much better.
Thanks so much for coming on.
A pleasure.